A new level of ambition and excellence thrives at the Texas Tech System. A $2 billion higher education enterprise with 4 diverse and distinguished universities. Because from here, it's possible.
Welcome to Saturday morning at the Texas Tribune Festival. It sounds like my voice is carrying here. Just make sure everybody can hear me. Very good. All right, so we are here for a discussion with former United States Senator Bill Bradley. Bill Bradley with a decorated career both in politics and obviously before that in sports. Was an All-American at Princeton, an Olympic gold medalist, a Rhodes Scholar, played for the New York Knicks, became a United States Senator from New Jersey in 1978. He was 35 years old at that point, so certainly puts me to shame with what I've done with my life. Served in the United States Senate for 3 terms till 1996, representing the state of New Jersey. Ran for president in 2000. Author of many books, including a very famous one called Life on the Run. And without any further ado, to talk about politics, sports, athletics, activism, Trump, everything, former Senator Bill Bradley. Is this the right side? Okay. All right. Senator Bradley.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm good. Here's what I'm going to...
You covered New Jersey, I understand.
I did. I covered New Jersey. So actually, I'll tell you what. One of the first big stories I covered in New Jersey politics involved you. And I'll see if you remember this.
It wasn't the scandal, was it?
Well, it wasn't a scandal involving you, but it was 16 years ago. It was in 2002, and it was a scandal involving Bob Torricelli, who had been the senator from New Jersey. He was running for re-election. This was in 2002. And about a month before the election, Bob Torricelli's poll numbers just collapsed in New Jersey. And the Democrats, they marginally controlled the Senate in Washington. They were terrified they were going to lose the Senate if they lost this race in New Jersey. So they pulled Bob Torricelli out of the Senate race 5 weeks before Election Day. They had to scramble to find a new candidate. I remember who their first choice was, and it was Bill Bradley. You didn't want to go back, though.
No, I didn't. I had 18 years representing New Jersey in the Senate. I thought the Senate was the best job you can possibly have, but then I'd moved on, and it was not a chance for me to go back.
And I wonder, fast forward 16 years later, 2018, we're here this morning. The Senate obviously taking center stage in Washington right now with the hearings about Brett Kavanaugh, going to move to the full Senate potentially with this investigation. When you look at those hearings this week, when you look at where the Senate is, where Washington is, you had called politics broken when you left the Senate. Where is it today?
Well, it's really broken, right? I had a couple reactions to the hearings. One of them actually is that the senators initially didn't do the questioning. I was in the Senate 18 years, and senators always did questioning. But here you had an attorney, a former prosecutor, doing the questioning, which I think maybe it happened once in Iran-Contra, and of course President Trump's old friend Roy Cohn was in the McCarthy hearings and asking questions.
That went well, huh?
But that's very unusual. I was struck by that. Second thing, I was struck by how it was like deja vu. I was there during the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, when you had a very accomplished woman, a professor, come in and describe something that's very painful and describe it very candidly and try to be responsive to questions. And then you had an angry male who came in. And when I saw Kavanaugh's response, I thought, you know, it's like out of the playbook of Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, there was a lot of people were comparing Clarence Thomas in 1991 comes in for the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, and he accuses his opponents of what he called, quote, a high-tech lynching. And the tone that Clarence Thomas took and the style that he took, similar to Brett Kavanaugh's. It worked for Clarence Thomas politically in 91 in terms of getting him confirmed. What's your sense on Kavanaugh right now?
Well, we'll see. I think there is this FBI investigation for a week. I guess I don't know if I'd like to be Mr. Judge, because he's the one guy that's going to finally have to speak on the record, in this case to the FBI, to say exactly what happened there. But I think this week also, for me, is a reflection of the extreme partisanship that exists in Washington. And it's unfortunate because there are a lot of things that are missed opportunities. I like to think historically, and I think back to the founding of the country when the question for the new nation was who should assume the debt of the states, right? And Hamilton said, let the federal government assume the debt of the states. We need to be creditworthy. Jefferson said, no, 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 Virginia is frugal. We are not going to have, we're not going to have the federal government assume the debts of Massachusetts and South Carolina that are not frugal. So it goes back and forth, and finally, Washington tells Jefferson, who's the Secretary of State, Hamilton, who's the Secretary of Treasury, get an agreement, get an agreement. And so they hammer back and forth, can't get it. Finally, Hamilton, ever inventive, suggests that if we move the capital from New York, which is where it was, to the banks of the Potomac, would Jefferson then agree for the federal assumption of debts? And Jefferson says, you got a deal. And so the federal government assumed the debts, and the capital moved to Washington. So the point here is not that event, which is depicted well in the musical Hamilton, if you've seen it, but what happened a few years later? What happened a few years later was Jefferson is now president, ironically, and France is having problems in Europe. They're fighting a war, Napoleon's fighting a war, he's short on cash. He decides he's going to sell that piece of property in the New World called Louisiana. And so he sells Louisiana to the United States for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States, and $10 million of the 15 is borrowed, which could never have happened had there not been an agreement on federal assumption of the debt, making the U.S. government's credit-worthy. And the point here is that extreme partisanship then would have meant we'd never had Louisiana. And extreme partisanship now, the real question is, what's the opportunity cost? We don't know what the opportunity cost is. We don't know what we might be missing down the road because we've been unable to get together and agree and respect each other.
I'm curious too, we're talking in terms of the, sorry, get that. That might be better, okay. You talk about the breakdown of bipartisanship, but one thing we did see yesterday on the Senate Judiciary Committee was this surprise of Jeff Flake, a Republican from Arizona. Everybody had been so dug in watching this hearing on Thursday, and it was that moment, that almost turning point moment where that prosecutor hired by the Republicans sort of put to the sidelines, Lindsey Graham took over, and then it was just one sort of, each side you were just getting very clear sort of almost like talking points. But then yesterday, you had meetings going on apparently privately between Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, Jeff Flake, Republican from Arizona, that reached this compromise. Did that give you any hope that maybe it's gotten so bad that maybe folks are now starting to look for solutions?
Oh, that's a positive development, but we'll see what happens, Let's see what the FBI comes up with. I think that it's easier than you think to cooperate across the aisle. In my time, for example, the last great immigration bill we had in this country, the guy who was in charge of it, the Republican Senate, was a guy named Al Simpson, a Republican of Wyoming. And I went to Simpson, and I had 22 questions on a yellow pad about the bill. And I asked him 22 questions. He answered. I agreed with 16 of his answers, not 6. And I then said to him when I left, because I thought overall move the country forward, you have my support. And I did not even know the Democratic position. So the Tax Reform Act of 1986, that happened and passed the Senate 97-3. Because on the Finance Committee, the chairman, Bob Packwood, a Republican, had 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans convene over a 2-week period, vote on every provision up or down, and sometimes it's 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat, sometimes 3 Democrats, 1 Republican. And whoever won, that's what everybody stood behind. So it is possible. Then in this current environment, it seems very difficult. The Coons-Flake agreement was on process.
Right, right.
And so it's great to have agreement on process, and process is sometimes very important. But the question is, can you get agreement on substance? Can you find compromise on tough substance? And that remains to be seen. It only takes, say, 5 or 6 Republicans and 5 or 6 Democrats in the Senate, and you've transformed the Senate. I mean, the reality is that 3 Republicans now control the future of the Senate in terms of Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, maybe Flake, for the remainder of this Congress. So it's not impossible to do, but in order to do that, you have to have courage, you have to know what you believe, and you have to respect your colleagues as human beings and therefore trust them in a legitimate negotiation.
Let me ask you too then about, and this gets into the world I sort of come from, but the effect that media has on the kind of polarization and partisanship you're talking about, because it strikes me that you're describing the bipartisanship with tax reform, for instance, in the late 1980s, and I'm thinking of what the media landscape was like back then. And CNN existed, but not in any form we'd recognize today. It was sort of brand new. There was no MSNBC, there was no Fox News, there was no internet, there was no Twitter, no social media. You had big newspapers, big broadcast networks. Did that make it easier for bipartisanship, that media wasn't so splintered and fractured?
No, I think that's exaggerated. The media is always the media. I mean, there were
That's actually good to hear.
There were always 15 or 20 reporters out when we left the room, somebody asking questions, right? The point is, we didn't tell them anything. And if you don't tell them anything, fine, they're doing their job. You talk about the weather and how, some inconsequential thing, but you don't tell them about who voted what way in this committee where you're actually trying to hammer out a bill. And so I think it's not just the media, but it's the politicians who don't have restraint in trying to get their name in print. I could never, everybody would leak. You're on the Intelligence Committee, right? You're not supposed to talk to anybody. So the journalist would call up and say, I know you can't say anything, it's secret, but just tell me, was that I heard from another source that the person was in the room, was she wearing a blue dress? So, and they'd call 15, 20 different people and stitch the door of the whole story, so you just don't participate, don't take the. Meanwhile, you respect the press. They have a job to do, and they're essential to our country. And to disrespect the press and its role in American society is in some ways, I think, not only undemocratic, but un-American.
Curious too, when you look at the landscape in Washington today, are there individual, particularly in the Senate, I think, are there individual Democrats and individual Republicans that you look at and that you see as having the potential or having shown some willingness to bridge the divide you're talking about?
Well, I'm not there, so I don't know the people as human beings. So it's very difficult for me to say. I remember, though, the late John McCain. I remember going down to see him because I was in the Senate with him. We actually did something I don't think that'll ever be done again in history. We were both running for president, him a Republican, me as a Democrat. Very contested primary on both sides in New Hampshire. And we have a joint press conference for tax reform, right? Not for campaign finance reform. And I don't think that'll ever happen again in a contested primary where 2 politicians of opposite parties actually get together on a particular issue. But I know John McCain was somebody who reminded us in his last years how important it is to work across the aisle. I remember going down to see him actually after the president was elected and having a kind of heart-to-heart with him about what this could mean for the country and what his role could be. And he knew that and he was willing to assume it. But of course, time didn't allow him to do as much as he could have done in a very critical moment. And there comes so that's what it's saying.
I'm curious too, because his final book that came out just at the end of his life struck an optimistic tone at the end of it. When you were talking to him, I'm curious, at the start of the Trump presidency, how was he absorbing Trump's election, what it meant for the country? Was he optimistic then? Was he?
Well, I think he was troubled. I mean, he didn't say, I'm troubled. My read was he knew there would be a moment where his voice would be very important for the country. He didn't know when it would come, but it would be, and he would be willing to step forward. And I think that was a mark of his character.
So you've mentioned the name we are obligated to talk about, Donald Trump. We've got to bring every segment around to him, it seems, in cable news. So we'll bring this discussion around to him a little bit. Something about him being president. I don't know. Well, I'm curious though. Like, here's the question I ask people about Donald Trump, and the fact that he's president. All of the issues we talk about in politics, the dysfunction, the polarization, the tribalism, how much of Trump is, and Trumpism, is a cause of that or a reflection of how that had already taken root? Is he a cause or a symptom? Is he more a cause or a symptom?
I think that that's an interesting question. The reality is he is there. He is who he is. In many ways, he represents the worst of our country. He appeals to the worst. I mean, I think of, we elected him President of the United States. So who are the people that elected him President of the United States? There are 6 groups, I think, that elected him President. One are Republicans who vote Republican no matter if Genghis Khan is on the ballot. Second are social conservatives that really just care about abortion and gay rights. Third are people who have been adversely affected by economic change in this country and have seen their living standards decline. Third, and who live like a couple of paychecks away from bankruptcy. Fourth, those people who want to, kind of fed up with Washington, want a fresh, cold breeze running through. Fifth are the racists who've always been with us and that Trump has legitimized by his campaign and his presidency. And sixth, there were the anti-Hillary people. Those were the 6 groups that elected President Trump to office. They each expected different things. They weren't all the same. And so if we think of the future, the key is to disaggregate that and say, who are the people in the coming elections that we have a chance of getting back? And I think that both the people who are adversely affected by economic change and the people who want to see a change in Washington, a fresh breeze blow through the town, are possibly gettable by Democrats.
It sounds like you're describing, what do you want to call them, the Rust Belt states, particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin?
Yeah, I'm actually part of a group called Rust Belt Rising, which started about 8 months ago and has offered any candidate for office as Democrat in the 6 states of the Rust Belt, counsel, substantive help, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are the key states. But I also think that the key race is the state legislative races. People don't understand state legislative races where the action is, because if you control the state legislature, you then control the redistricting of Congress every 10 years. And in 2010, Democrats were patting ourselves on the back saying, well, demographic change in America, permanent Democratic majority, while Republicans were saying, well, now what can we do? What can we find out we could do? And there were 2 or 3 of them, actually, who then managed to get money. And what they decided to do was they were going to go into states and for very little money try to flip legislatures. And they succeeded in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, and Florida. And they went in and they flipped them. Therefore, when the census took place in 2010, and the districts were to be drawn, they would now be drawn by Republican state legislators that turned 50 45 Democratic districts to 55-45 and sometimes 60-40 Republican districts. And they did it very consciously with high-tech analytical tools. Let's say in Detroit, right? It used to be Detroit had a couple of congressional districts. They were competitive, they were suburbs, and they were parts of city. They instead created one giant district in the city that was 95% Democratic, and then took all of the districts that were suburbs and turned those into separate districts with no votes coming from Detroit. The result was they picked up 4 or 5 seats in the Michigan delegation alone by doing this. And this particular map is famous because not only was it just Detroit, but then there was one little road that led to Pontiac, which is also 98% Democratic and African American. They put that in the district too, just so that you wouldn't be shocked that they were using this strategy. So the race, the state legislative races are where it is. I mean, that's the action. You don't do that, you don't get to Congress. You look at this election, I'm all for Nancy and the Democrats. And they think, you know, we think we're going to win, I hear they think we're going to win 30 seats. Great. I look at the numbers and I say, okay, but I'm not positive of that. I'd like to believe that, but I'm not positive of that just by looking at the numbers. And so I see that and I say, you know, we have a lot to do in our own party. I mean, I once wrote an article about something called the inverted pyramid, where I said, you think of the parties, Republicans begin with a base that's called money, lots of money. They then have a lot of think tanks that the money funds. Think tanks come up with ideas. They then have a marketing level. How do you sell the ideas? They then have a political level, including the dark arts of politics, of character assassination. How do we get the people elected? At the top of the pyramid is the candidate. All this is prepared for the candidate. If you take Democrats, invert the pyramid. Every presidential candidate has to invent his own thing, everything. And so we need to understand that the issue is really about getting people to the polls and getting people to vote in the key elections, in this case state legislative and also congressional. And I say that because, you know, if you look at our, just to take a quick glance at our history, I mean, democracy has brought America great progress since the founding of this country. Higher living standards, higher life expectancy, greater literacy. So democracy can give progress, but it can't always, it doesn't guarantee permanence. For example, the Emancipation Proclamation lost to Jim Crow. Our moral standing in the world after Vietnam lost to Vietnam. Labor lost to deep-pocketed money interests. So we can't guarantee permanence. And to me, the thing that is most important is that we have to understand that we get the kind of country that we ask for through the vote. And in 2016, there were 100 million Americans who did not vote, who were over 18. 100 million Americans. 50 million are registered, 40 million of them not registered. And so, you know, we can control our future if we want to. So efforts should go to getting people to vote and then understanding with clarity what they're voting for. And I think that if we did that, we would be much better off as a country.
So what was, in terms of motivating people to vote, getting people interested to vote and go out and turn out for Democrats, you're saying, I'm curious, because you made reference there to a period that seems like ancient history now, but it's only a couple years ago, where Democrats felt the demographics of the country, the demographics of the electorate were changing in such a way that Republicans were going to either have to change or go extinct. And even the Republicans after the 2012 election, they came up with this autopsy report, and they basically concluded the same thing. Then they nominated a candidate who violated everything they put in their autopsy report, and that candidate won. When Democrats were looking after 2012 at a president reelected twice with more than 50% of the vote, remember they were talking about the blue wall states, all these states that had not gone Republican since 1988, the demographic changes in the country. Barack Obama, by the fall of 2016, I remember standing at that board. We had a week before the election. We checked his approval rating well over 50%. We were looking at 57%. And yet still, I know Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I know there's all sorts of other circumstances people talk about, but the bottom line was it was razor thin and a path was left for Donald Trump to get in there. What were Democrats missing? What was going on in this country that Democrats were missing?
Well, I wouldn't say just about Democrats, because obviously there were the 6 groups the Democrats didn't pay attention to enough, the economic change people and the Washington change people. But I like to think what Democrats need is to look at, you're in Austin, Texas, right? It's raining in Austin, Texas. And what you need to do is you need to think of LBJ. A day or two after the assassination, LBJ was in a room with Bill Moyers and Jack Valenti. And he said, essentially, I want to do Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights. He said, and I have the power now, and I'm going to use it. In other words, clarity about what you want to do. That starts in the brain of the politician. What is it that you want to do that you're going to tell the people you're going to do? And the clearer we are with the kind of America we want, with very clear steps to get there, the stronger we're going to be, I think, as a party.
Yeah, I just got to say, as the skies open up here, we were backstage before, and I said to Senator...
Now, wait a minute. My iPhone says there's 10%.
I said, good news, it's not going to rain today. And, the forecast looked like it had improved this morning, so maybe this will go quickly.
I think the heavens are crying because of Trump.
Look at this. I wanted to ask you too. I mentioned your background in sports. You made the transition from sports to politics, going from the New York Knicks to the U.S. Senate from New Jersey. Sports have been intersecting with politics a lot more, I think, in the last couple of years. A lot of it has to do with Donald Trump making an issue out of the national anthem protests. LeBron James, I think most notably from the, now with the Lakers, but with the Cavs, was willing to get into it very publicly with the president, not just on issues with the anthem, but other issues in general. In particular, besides the anthem protests in the NFL, NBA players, a lot of NBA players have been a lot more outspoken. What do you make of that rise of activism, very visible activism we've seen from athletes? What is driving it, and do you see it having an effect?
I salute it, and I think what's driving it is that people realize athletes are citizens too and have their own opinions. And I look at this and I think Donald Trump is going to go wherever there's press, right? And a lot of people are interested in sports, and sports is very intensely emotional. That's his bailiwick, and he knows how to divide. So he uses sports to divide people, and that's something that to me is so antithetical to what sports is, because if you win a championship, you have to be a team. You're taught from a very early age unselfishness, imagination, courage, all those values, right? Well, those are disregarded when you use the sport to divide people, in my opinion. I think players have a right to say what they believe. If you look at the NBA, one of the things Adam Silver has done that I think is really exceptional is he has encouraged players to be involved politically, to do something in their communities, to have opinions about national issues, to express them, encourage them to use their well-knownness to further their view of what America should be. And I think that's terrific.
There's also,
and I also think that, a couple of years ago there was this Colin Kaepernick issue, kneeling, and when that occurred, I remember I was surfing or looking at issues, and I saw a story that had a picture of the home of Colin Kaepernick's parents in the Central Valley of California. It was a picture of a modest bungalow that had a big American flag flying in front of it, right? In other words, we believe that we have a right to speak in this country, and we're doing that, and that's what the flag is all about. And therefore, let's respect people who want to express themselves, and they have a right to do in this country for the kind of world they'd like to see.
I think to take, I'm tempted to say, to frame this as saying to take Trump aside, but maybe Trump is the answer to this, and I'm curious what you think. I can remember back, it's 20 years ago. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it was 20 years ago. There was an NBA player named Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. He played under the name Chris Jackson in college at LSU, but he played for the Denver Nuggets in the late 1990s. And he decided one day that he was going to refuse to stand for the national anthem. And his reasons were very similar to Colin Kaepernick's reasons 20 years later. When that happened in the late 1990s in this country, though, he was instantly a pariah. I remember they could not get, Bill Clinton was president, they could not get the Clinton White House to make any kind of a statement on this. They didn't want to talk about it. No political figures rallied to his side. No celebrities rallied to his side. I know it's been controversial for Kaepernick, and he's got plenty of detractors, but he's got a Nike deal too. What's changed in this country where 20 years ago, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf does that and is an outcast, and 20 years later, Colin Kaepernick does it and is controversial but has a place?
I like to think we've matured as a nation, and we've learned that we're all part of our country, whatever your ethnicity or religion or race is in this country. And I think that's what it says. It says that is one picture of progress in America. I also think Adam Silver has done a great job because he said to players, be politically active. Go out there and change the world, but leave the game the game. And so you've not had the issue in the NBA that you've had in the NFL because you had leadership that understood the players were really interested in the substance of change, not in the process of change. And so I think that's another kudo for Adam Silver. And you look back at those times. I remember when this dates me, but I remember when Lou Alcindor became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And quite frankly, if you ask Kareem, he will say, it affected the way people reacted to him. But to the players, to overall, what you wanted is you wanted somebody who was a great player. He was still the same person at center scoring 30 points a game. And because of his talent, who cares? And I think he also spoke with a great authority about his beliefs, which I think was enormously helpful in educating people in this country. I don't usually give George W. Bush credit for much, but after 9/11, he goes to a mosque. Our battle is not with Islam, it is with terrorism. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need more of.
I wanted to ask you a couple questions too, looking to the future of the Democratic Party, which is going to need a candidate for president in this time next year. We're going to be having debates, and I'm thinking this room wouldn't be big enough to hold all the candidates who might be running for the Democratic nomination. A couple things I want to ask you about that. I guess number one, I just say is this: you run for president. You've had the experience of running. You know what it's like. You've also had the experience before you ran of serving in the Senate and having people tell you you should be running for president. I'm curious, when you look at every Democrat in the Senate right now in particular who's looking to run for president, but every Democrat in general, what advice do you give them right now at this point?
Decide what you really believe and how you want to communicate that, and run on that. You get so caught up in process, who's up, who's down, who's got these delegates. That's all important, but that's not fundamental. And, you know, I think that when you run for president, it's easy to get hooked on pleasing the crowds and on having strangers come up and tell you how wonderful you are. But the real ego involved in running for president is actually saying that you want to be the most powerful person in the world, that you have the audacity to opine about any subject in life, right? That you you're willing to accept the moral weight of sending young Americans into war.
Was that when you made the decision to run for president? Was that a moment for you when what you're describing, you had to look in the mirror and say, yes, that's me?
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I also had to think that I had a team that could govern, had to know what I wanted to do if I was elected. So I had great plans of what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, I didn't have the right kind of plan to get elected. So that goes back to the point. You got to get elected.
Do you have a sense that, when I say this room might not be big enough to hold all the candidates, I think one of the reasons so many Democrats are looking to run is there's a sense after 2016 that what we thought were the rules of American politics are either shattered or maybe never were the rules to begin with. Do you get that sense at all?
Well, look, it's free to run for president now, to be talked of. I'm considering it. I'm thinking I haven't closed my options. So you become mentioned. All right. Well, let's actually get to the point where you put yourself on the line. How many people are going to really put themselves on the line? And of those, how many people are going to have a clear idea of where they take the country? I think we have a lot of talent in the Democratic Party. And I'm not saying that the Democrats don't have the advantage with talent or that this isn't an opportunity. I'm simply saying it's important for people to know what they believe before they step out there, and that they understand that this is a contact sport. I mean, you know, particularly with Donald Trump. And you have to be willing to put your whole family at risk. You have to be willing to have outrageous things said. You have to be willing to have your garbage looked through by detectives. You have to be willing to be followed wherever you are in the country. I mean, I remember when I ran, for 40 years at that point, I had a place on an island in Greece. It's a long story, okay, in terms of college classmates and so forth. So we built this thing. It was on all of my Senate disclosure reports. I own a chunk of this, right? So I run for president, and lo and behold, on this little desolate Greek island, a detective shows up and asks the mayor, you know, what did Bradley do when he was here on this island? Was there ever any drinking or any other thing? And, you know, so you got to be willing
to get everything.
You got to be willing to open yourself up to that kind of inquiry and assault.
I'm not putting you on the spot for the Bill Bradley endorsement, but I'm curious when you look at
the Bill Bradley endorsement has no value, but that's okay.
Well,
I appreciate you.
Well, I'm curious, but who impresses you when you look at the Democratic bench right now, if you want to call it that? Who impresses you? Who stands out?
You can't. I'm going to leave somebody out. The normal political thing is for me to mention everybody, right? So I don't leave anybody saying, "Oh my God, he didn't mention." So I don't know. I mean, I can give you a quick handicap on things, but right now it's free. Joe Biden is an old friend of mine of 50 years. I probably know him very well. He is the one person. It's ironic because in politics, if you're a politician, you want to be viewed by people as not being a politician but a human being, right? Joe Biden's no longer a politician. He's a human being. He's a father. He's a grandfather. He's a man who suffered tragedy publicly before us. We've seen him grow. And So he's not a politician in that sense. And yet he's one of the most political people ever to run for president. So that's interesting. Cory Booker is, you know, kind of protege or close to me since high school in New Jersey. I like Cory. Steve Bullock is a really interesting guy out of Montana, I think. And then, of course, you have, you know, Elizabeth and Bernie and all the others, Camilla. I mean, I'm just mentioning names that I read in the newspaper. I don't know all these
Booker's
people,
got
right?
Booker's got your old seat, right? It's the same same seat from your
Yeah.
old Senate seat. So
Yeah.
a little bit of lineage there. I want to leave a couple minutes here just to get some questions. How about a hand first, though, for Bill Bradley? And we got we do have a microphone, so let's get some questions here. But just if you wouldn't mind, just go to the microphone. I think there's only limited reach here. But let's open the floor up.
Thank you for coming here. You didn't talk about tax reform. My ex-state representative, Kevin Brady, pushed through a tax reform that blew up the deficit. He's talking about tax reform 2.0, which will destroy Medicare and Social Security. Do you have any thoughts about the current tax reform?
The current tax reform is not tax reform. The current tax bill is a kind of giveaway. When you do tax reform, you have to be informed by a few principles. For example, in '86, we said, well, what the things we'd measure what we did against is we believe equal income should pay equal tax. We believe those who have more should pay more. We believe that the market was the best allocator of resources, and we did not want to increase the deficit. Those were the criteria that we set against which we would measure what we did. The tax bill that passed, which is giving the economy a giant sugar high right now for another year, was essentially totally inconsistent in terms of tax policy. It was a gift to large corporations in America, to the wealthy. Middle class got something, but now the only language Republicans seem to know is, I want a tax cut, I want a tax cut. And of course, the ultimate objective, as you've said, is the tax cut. They want to defund government so that they then put all the pressure on Medicare, Social Security, the social programs that we've come to see as the essence of what our commitment to each other as citizens and human beings are, put pressure to cut those. I also think that there's a real irony here, and that is Trump has put all these tariffs on, right? Well, who is hurt by the tariffs? Farmers are hurt. And I ran into, I went to Mccain's funeral, and I talked to a senator from a farm state, and I said, how are your farmers like those tariffs? He said, they hate those tariffs, but they love the guy, meaning Trump, because they think he's got a plan, right? Well, if there's one thing Trump does not have, it's a plan, right? And so this time, February, March, April of next year is when the farm economy is going to be hammered by tariffs and loss of markets abroad because of the tariffs. It's at that point that the irony will emerge. What Republicans will do, since they are farm states politicians, they'll say, oh my God, we have to make up what they've lost. We'll have to pass a bill and use that money to pay to the farmers, as they did this year for $14 billion, right? To help tide the farmers over, to win. They'll get their markets back, which they won't do as long as there are tariffs. And so I look at this and I say, you know, this is going to come back and bite the farm state senators, unless they decide that what they really want, in the words Republicans use so adeptly, is welfare for farmers, because that's where it's headed.
I'm just amazed that the so-called deficit hawks, the Freedom Caucus and all the Republicans that constantly scream about cutting the deficit are okay with exploding it to what, $1.5 trillion.
Yeah,
it's
well,
just the hypocrisy is amazing.
There is a difference. If you're cutting taxes on wealthy people, they'll generate more economic activity, they'll generate more revenue, which never happens. That's the argument. Never happens. And so you end up with a $1.5 trillion increase in deficit because of the tax bill. And at some point, that's going to create a problem. You look out in our economy now, you get long-term interest rates go up 2, 3 points, 4 points. Suddenly, you can make money on your old on bonds, right? Not all the money drains out of the equity markets. You end up with a dramatic drop in purchasing power in the country. You stimulate inflation. Interest rates go up further, and we end up in a very bad recession. Now, it's not me. This is a Republican economist named Martin Feldstein. Makes this argument very clearly in, I think, Wall Street Journal op-ed 3 or 4 days ago.
Thank you, Senator Bradley, for being here. As an expatriate New Jerseyan, I'm glad to see you. As a Reformed Jew with 4 Jewish children, I look at what is going on right now, and I see similarities.
I'm sorry, we're not getting...
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Okay. So as a Reformed Jew with 4 Jewish children, I look at what's happening now. I see parallels to what happened in Germany, obviously. On the other hand, I look and I say, we are not the Weimar Republic. We have much stronger institutions, et cetera. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that fear. Is it a legitimate fear? And if it is, what can we do about it?
You know, I think your question itself is an indication of how much has changed. I mean, in the course of 2 years, responsible, intelligent people are now saying, oh, we're headed toward Nazi Germany, right? I think that's an overstatement. I know you didn't make that statement, but your fear is rooted in fascism returning to the world. And indeed, if you look at Hungary, if you look at Poland, if you look at a few other places in the world, you do find the authoritarians are coming back into power. But in this country, there's one thing that I believe would stop that. That's the institutions of our democracy. They're available for us to make. Now, I think if Kavanaugh is nominated, the Supreme Court is lost, and that's for a while. And that's unfortunate on multiple levels. It's unfortunate on campaign finance reform. It's unfortunate on voting rights. It's unfortunate on choice. It's unfortunate on a lot of levels. But that's what's at stake here. I think, though we have elective, we have legislative and executive as well as judicial. And if you're concerned about that, now is the time to go out there and do something about it. I mean, for example, there are more women running now than ever before. There's more activism out there more than ever before. The question is, will that activism be enough to overcome the redistricting advantages in November that Republicans established in 2010? And if they are not, what happens then? And my view is you redouble your efforts. And you'd say 100 million people in America don't vote. That's wrong. I mean, there's a voter suppression effort going on in the part of Republicans. Right here in Texas is a good example of that. But you have to get people. We can control our future here. This is not some place where we don't have the institutions. The institutions haven't failed here, but people haven't used the institutions in ways that get the kind of world that they want to have. And I think that's the point. Now, so if I'm just dealing with your fear, I just redouble your effort, teach your kids what America is, tell them to read the Lincoln's second inaugural, right, about what America really is. I mean, keep in mind, We talk about division now. The country was at war, right? The country was at war. Lincoln was elected. He stands up to the podium and he says, if I can remember it, with malice toward none and charity for all. With firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, to strive to end this war, to strive to end this war, to help those who have fought and their widows and their children, and to build a better world. This is the President of the United States at a time where two sides are at war, not just people yapping at each other on Fox News and MSNBC or what else, but this is war. And there is a leader who says there's something more important here. And he believes in the people. So I would say believe in yourself. Keep in mind that there have been times much worse than this in the past. Have faith in the institutions of our country and go out there and, you know, get your kids out there working in a state legislative race.
Thank you.
And we got time for, this will be the final question, unfortunately, but this will, we got time for one more here, so let's hear it.
Well, she asked my question, but I'm going to be a fanboy and say, I was in Madison Square Garden when you scored 41 points against Michigan and Cassie Russell, a former teammate. I'm from New Jersey. I also was there for your debut with the Knicks, so I'm your fanboy. Ask a real question.
Okay.
Well, my question was going to...
You're my fanboy. You were there for the debut. I mean, that's an interesting thing. So I went to Oxford. I came back. I signed to play with the Knicks. You know, the first night was the game you saw. Every time I touched the ball in warm-ups, 18,000 people went berserk, right? When I touched the ball in warm-ups, Bradley goes in for the layup. Oh, hey! About, I'd say, 5 weeks later, when it was clear that I was too slow to play guard, the cheers turned, the crowd turned on me. They booed, they threw coins, they spit, and they accosted me in the street with Bradley, you overpaid bum, right? Which only, and I will tell you, that experience, there is nothing that I experienced in politics. All the vitriol, all the parts that can come close to matching how you feel when 19,500 people are spitting on you. And so I look at that, you know, but thanks for staying with me, because I got my break the following year, and we went on and did pretty well. I moved forward. So we're talking a little basketball here, because I picked up that there was an interest in the crowd to talk about the old days. I didn't realize the crowd was so old.
All right. Well, there, former Senator Bill Bradley.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.